Hey guys, it's Bree here at Blossom and Branch Farm. Today we're going to go through our food forest. If you've seen videos of the farm before, you know that this is our main production field here. So in the front yard we have our lavender, then we have our house. In the backyard we have our perennial peony fields and also our flower production field. So all of our cut flowers are produced back here, as well as a lot of our vegetables like our tomatoes, our onions, our peppers, and other various things. We just grow them all together. So that's going to be a whole nother tour for a separate time. But for today, I wanted to show you this side of the farm, and this is our food forest. Now, when we moved in 5 years ago and we bought this property, we couldn't even walk back here. It's hard to explain how bad it was, other than to say that we had a fence running down that went all the way across here, and we couldn't even walk back there. It was so overgrown with invasive plants, a lot of buckthorn, thistle, chest-high thistle everywhere. And so the first 3 years was really focused on removing a lot of those invasives. We still have some like these Siberian elms, which we're working on taking down, but because these are big trees, they're expensive to take down because we do have neighbors to contend with, so we have to do it carefully and slowly. But we've gotten almost all of our honeysuckle out. We've gotten a lot of our hoary cress and our buckthorn, burdock. Now what we've been left with is some of the original plants, which we've been spreading. What's been great has been to see, as we've cleared out a lot of those invasive plants, what's been happening with our natives. So the native plants have really started to thrive as we've been removing all of those invasives that have been taking sunlight and water and nutrients from these plants. So the first one that we have is American plum, and the American plum is native to many parts of the United States actually, and it's a suckering plant. So you can see it's a low grower, it's a shrub, and it produces these beautiful plums that are not only delicious for human consumption, but they're also an attractant for birds. So it's not just the fruit on the plants that the birds like, they also like the shape of the plant itself. So you can see how much undergrowth is here. There's a lot of great hiding spots for birds to hop around in and to forage in, and that's important because over here we've got our pumpkin arbors. So one of the things that people ask me when they see the pumpkin alley, our little pumpkin trellis here, is how do you mitigate squash vine borers? Because the squash vine borer is a really common problem with pumpkins and squash. There are a couple things that you can try, and one is to plant things like trap crops like Hubbard squash, which actually attract the squash vine borer. That serves as a trap crop, so they'll leave your main production, pumpkins and squash, alone. Or you can do what we've done, which is plant them strategically next to those American plums, which attract a lot of birds. So birds are one of the primary predators of the squash vine borer. So by getting those birds here really close to our pumpkins and our squash, there are always a lot of birds in and around this arbor, which really helps a lot with mitigation of those squash vine borers and other various things that might want to nibble at these. Now it does help that they're up also on this trellis. We'll talk about this trellis a little bit more during our main field farm tour, but for now let's head back to the food forest. So how do we use these American plums? There are a couple ways, and these ones are just about ripe. I'd actually love to do a harvest real quick. You can tell as soon as they start to just gently fall off into your hands, and they turn a little bit of a, almost a dusty looking, that they're ready. So they have a very thick skin, so not quite as good as a typical plum that you buy at the store in terms of eating out of hand, but really, really good for syrups, good for jams, preserves, those kinds of things. My favorite is to make a simple syrup out of it and use it to mix things like lemonades or cocktails. Here we have another native one that's actually planted itself, and these have started to, again, spread as we've been removing our invasives. This is a currant. So we have a lot of golden currants in the field. We'll talk about that and why we have those in our next tour. But these have been spread by the birds, and these also produce a berry. There's a lot of currants that are native to North America. They are very good for eating. I find them delicious. They're different colors. There's black, there's gold. And they also turn a beautiful foliage color in the fall, so kind of reddish, pinkish, burgundy, really dramatic, and pretty blossoms in the spring that smell fantastic. So those two plants have really been spreading, but let me show you the third one. that I really enjoy, and this is not common. So we do have apple trees and those kinds of things back here in this food forest as well. Because this was an orchard originally 80 years ago, there are still some remnant trees that still bear apples. We're constantly still weeding stuff out of the food forest, so even though we are always working on taking out weeds, our job is never done, so there's always still weeds to go. And we also do have our sheep that help us out in a couple of areas where we're hoping to expand some more plants and more of our prairie meadow areas, but they're grazing down some invasive grasses right now. What we have been planting in terms of grasses back here, and what we're trying to really spread, is native ground cover. So over here you can see where we're working in sections to do that. So what I do is I'll pile up some wood chips, leave it for a season so that kind of kills out anything that's growing there in terms of surface weeds. Then we clear away that mulch, kind of move it to the next spot and seed in here. This is blue grama that you see in here. Blue grama is a native drought tolerant grass. So because we don't have irrigation back here in the woods and we're really dry here in Colorado, we only get, I think last year or this year we've maybe gotten 10 inches of precipitation. And so this can survive and thrive without additional irrigation. So you can see how the blue grama is helping to spread and cover the ground, which is helping us with weed prevention here. So as we clear away these wood chips, then we'll seed this area. We'll just move these chips to the next spot and we just keep seeding so we can really focus on one small area every year. So a couple of the other plants that we have back here in the food forest include some keystone species. So keystone species are native plants that host a lot of native pollinators and habitat wildlife. So there are a couple ways that having keystone species help us here, and really the main ways are ecosystem building. So we're building our soil food web, which goes all the way up through mammals and birds and hawks and owls, which help keep mice and things in control. But we have a cottonwood, which I know is a oft-hated tree here in suburban areas because it tends to drop limbs. But they are a keystone species. This hosts so much wildlife for us here. We also have a hackberry. Hackberries do produce some fruit, but really this one is just here planted by squirrels, but they are a good native plant. And then we also have willows, and willows are a really, really vital early pollinator supporting tree. Also one that isn't necessarily favored because they tend to be weak and they need a lot of water, but those willows do provide a lot of ecosystem and habitat support, which is really the main goal of this food forest area. But since we're talking about it, let's head back here and show a couple of the last areas of our food forest here. Now this is another suckering area of our food forest. So these are young chokecherries, and I love chokecherries, and they're so underappreciated and unloved. And part of the reason for that is because they do have this suckering habit. So you can see how much these spread in just a couple of seasons. We have to constantly prune them back, and we just use a big bush hog to do that. But if we don't want them growing and spreading, then we do have to keep up with them constantly. But they do return benefits in terms of attracting birds. So as I've mentioned many times in our videos, birds are so underappreciated when it comes to ecosystem building in the garden and helping with pest management. So by having these chokecherries in and around, and we'll see if we have any that are still fruiting, but just even having those adjacent to our field, we don't have to do any kind of pest management, because in addition to bird water and natural habitat, so beyond just giving them bird food and bird seed, providing them habitat and providing them native berry plants. And here we've got some of our crabapples, some of our original apple trees here from this property. A lot of these crabapples were here obviously when we moved in. These are quite large already. Crabapples, great for things like crabapple jelly, crabapple jam. All right, I had to stop for a quick snack. Here's one of the apples that was here when we moved here, and I think this is one of the original apples left from when this was an orchard. These are actually really delicious apples. They're crunchy. They have great flavor. They're really good for baking and lots of different things. And it's also very disease tolerant. Unlike the Honey Crisps that we grow up front by the house, this one never gets blight. It never seems to have any issues. So sometimes these older heirloom varieties can be a little bit more well adapted. Now down in here is one of the last areas I want to show you, which is an area that we've been working on converting. It looks horrible and terrible now because almost all these plants are dead. But what we've been working on is mitigating this area. So this was another area that was full of invasive weeds and invasive grasses. So we have, over the last 4 years it's taken us to finally clear out all these weeds. It took repeated solarizations, it took a till, it's taken all kinds of different methods to try to get all this killed. And then we've been seeding in things like native perennial sunflowers, blue tansy, buckwheat. We have blue grama growing in here as well, milkweed. This is a black walnut tree, which is native. And I love this blue tansy because it's a really great pollinator supporting plant, and it does reseed quite readily. So you can see all the seeds that are coming off of this blue tansy, those are just gonna drop back onto the ground and reseed for next year. And blue tansy has a lot of medicinal benefits, and it also is a great supporter of our native pollinators. So even though it looks like nothing right now, you can see some of them that are still in bloom, and they do have this really sweet purple bloom. But if you're gonna plant blue tansy, I would definitely plant some other things with it, like buckwheat and like grasses, because otherwise you can see as it gets later in the summer, this really looks quite rough. We have some squash plants over here also that are serving as ground cover in some of our particularly weedy areas, just to try to help combat some of that weed spread. The more we can keep the ground covered, the better. And so squash can be great for that because this hasn't had any water. And also, we don't have to really weed around it because it's helping just suppress the weeds by shading out the ground here in these areas, other than that Siberian elm we have to cut down. All right, let's see if we can find any. Here's some more of this blue tansy. We'll just kind of, this is a lot of fill dirt that came from our construction project, which we're gonna be showing you here soon, the final results. But we're gonna be rehabbing a couple fill dirt areas. So if you have fill dirt, or if you're starting with fill dirt, we're going to show how you can remediate and rehab that dirt into growing dirt. Let's pop over here. We've got more apples, more chokecherries, more American plums, another black walnut. It's taken a lot of time for me to learn all of these different native plants and to be able to identify them from seedling stage so that we can get them under control early. If we do have the invasives coming in. I'm just looking for any chokecherries that have any berries left. So here's a remnant, one of our last remaining chokecherries. These tend to fruit earlier in the season, and now we just have a few left, but the birds do swoop in the morning and they eat all the little dried ones here along these plants, and they are full. The chokecherries are really good for things like syrups. They're not great for eating just straight, and they're also really not good for things like jams because the pit is so big, but you could make jelly. And we also do chokecherry syrup out of them, which is really good. Chokecherry was a very important plant to the indigenous people, so they would use a lot of chokecherries in dried applications. They would dry it and make it into kind of a fruit leather. And again, just a really unappreciated plant in North America. All right, what's last? We do have some Virginia creeper here, which kind of serves a little bit of the same purpose as the squash. So you can see it's covering the ground as Virginia creeper will do. It creeps and spreads, and a lot of people don't like Virginia creeper, and they like to say that it is invasive, but actually Virginia creeper is native to much of North America. It is aggressive, so a lot of native plants can be aggressive, and Virginia creeper is one, but we still leave them because they help with things like covering the ground, and they also help with attracting birds because they do provide good bird habitat, and they provide berries, which feed the birds, and they're a trap crop for our Japanese beetles, which helps keep them out of our field, which we're now back to. So you can see here we've got this, the food forest in total, I'd say is about maybe half an acre, slightly less, but very, very important in terms of the support that it provides our farm. And you can do this on a small scale. So just because we have a half an acre and you probably don't have a half an acre maybe to just dedicate to bird support, we're going to show you how you can incorporate this into a smaller garden when we do our field tour. So make sure you're tuning in for that. We'll be showing that one next. And in the meantime, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe and share and do all those things. It really means a lot to us here at the farm. And see you guys around here next time.